Good morning, everybody from Washington, D.C. And if you're located in the West Coast, very early morning to you. For our friends in Asia, good evening. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining for our book talk event today. Very excited for our discussion today as it covers truly the book that we're covering today is just huge in scope, but also fun read, very accessible read. And that book, of course, is The Tiger Leading the Dragon: How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise. Before we go into our discussion, I did want to lay down just a few logistical rules for our event. So you'll see on your right-hand side of the screen a couple features. We do ask throughout the event if you have a question to ask our panelists by the end of the presentation to please use the Q&A chat feature. So please type your question, please include your name and affiliation so that we know who we are addressing. And please refrain from using the chat itself. Please type your questions in the Q&A box. If you mistakenly type in the chat, we'll help you redirect. But please use the Q&A function. That will help us keep track of all the questions coming in our way. And also, this relates to our book giveaway. We're going to be giving away a free copy of Shelley Rigger's book. And so all you have to do to enter, as long as you registered for this event, is also to submit a question. And this is where the name and affiliation is important because we'll be linking your question with your registration. So please, when you ask your question, include your name and affiliation so that you can also be included in the pool for our book giveaway, which we will announce after the event. So now on to the topic of discussion, The Tiger Leading the Dragon: How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise. I'll first start off with introducing our speakers. So Shelley Rigger, the author of the book, is Brown Professor of East Asian Politics at Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina. She has a PhD in government from Harvard University and a BA in public and international affairs from Princeton University. She has been a visiting researcher at National Chengchi University in Taiwan and a visiting professor at Fudan University in Shanghai. Her monograph, Taiwan's Rising Rationalism, Generations, Politics, and Taiwan Nationalism, was published by the East-West Center in November 2006. Our audience members may also be familiar with Shelley's previous work, including Why Taiwan Matters, truly seminal work for many Taiwan followers, including myself, and now another addition to that collection. After Shelley Rigger's presentation on her book, we're going to welcome comments from GW Professor Bruce Dickson, who received his BA in Political Science and English Literature, MA in Chinese Studies, and PhD in Political Science from the University of Michigan. He joined the faculty of George Washington University and the Elliott School in 1993, and Professor Bruce Dickson is truly a titan in the field of China Studies, China Domestic Politics. You may know some of his published works, including The Dictator's Dilemma, and just this year, he also published another book titled The Party and the People, which Sigur Center did a launching over the summer. He will be offering comments about Shelley Rigger's presentation and the book. And after Shelley's presentation and Bruce's comments, we'll open up to Q&A from the audience. Before I turn it over to Shelley, I do want to set a little bit of the stage for our audience about the scope that her new book covers. I myself do not have a political economy background, which, by the way, I realize I failed to introduce myself. I'm Richard Haddock, Program Manager at the East Asia National Resource Center. And I tackle Taiwan especially from a public diplomacy, education, and international affairs lens. So political economy has not truly been in my wheelhouse. And this book, I have to say, has done a fantastic job at making the political economy of Taiwan intersectional with history, with politics, with identity, with social issues. And this book covers everything from pre-colonial era Taiwan all the way through China's dynasties and Japanese colonialism to the present day. And it not only touches on economics, but it touches on people-to-people interactions, on how Taiwan's multifaceted society has impacted not only the global economic development, but especially China's. And this book really sheds new light on the importance of Taishang, of the Taiwanese business community operating in China, but also the two-way and omnidirectional influence that's going between the island and the mainland. So I'm really excited to be able to host this book talk where we'll talk about everything from economic theory to TSMC and other multinational corporations to even Buzz Lightyear and Toy Story. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Shelley Rigger.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I'll just start right off by confessing that I too lack a background in political economy, but it did not stop me from writing this book on actually political economy, ironically, or if not directly on political economy, then on the effects of the cross-strait economic relationship, not only on politics, but also on the economics and cultural and people-to-people and all the other dimensions of cross-strait relations. So happy to share this with you today. And I am going to just put some pictures up here for you to enjoy, I hope, while I talk. So the tiger leading the dragon is motivated, the title is motivated by the idea that, you know, since the 1980s and Hoda Jen's famous song about the descendants of the dragon has represented China in kind of international iconography. And Taiwan has for a long time been one of those little dragons, the four little dragons of Northeast Asia. But the claim that I make in this book is that, you know, for the last 40 years almost, or at least for the last 30 years, the tiger has in some ways been in the leading position, and the dragon has been led by the tiger. So the book is really rooted in this very simple motivation, this mystery that so many of us have been thinking about for decades now, which is, you know, how did this China thing happen, right? This is Huashanlu in Shanghai in 1980. It's not exactly the same intersection, but it's the same street in 2006. And, you know, another way to make the same point is to look at economic figures. So here we have PRC exports between 1978 and 2020, and it shows us the same picture, right? Just massive, massive change in a relatively short period of time. The big inflection point that many of us point to for the really rapid acceleration in China's exports is, of course, joining the WTO. But what I found as I kind of dug into this a little bit more is that the scale of this graph masks another very important inflection point in China's economic history. So if we back up the graph and we cut it off in 2000, we see that there's another rapid increase, another sort of sharp upturn in PRC exports that is kind of overwhelmed when we put the post-2000 figures on there. But that's also really significant from the perspective of this 20-year span. And so that led me to this question, which is the question that I think lots of people are asking and answering in various ways. How did the PRC, which had no private property or business at all in 1976 when these trends were beginning, become the factory to the world by the early 2000s? And for my answer to this question, I put another inflection point on the graph, which is 1987, the year when Taiwan opened to the PRC, and it became possible for Taiwanese people and Taiwanese businesses to begin making the journey across the Taiwan Strait. And so my answer to how the PRC managed to become this export powerhouse is that that foreign direct investment is the driving factor in specifically the increase in China's exports. And in particular, foreign direct investment that took the form of manufacturing investment, mainly by ethnic Chinese from overseas. So it's less about MNCs or portfolio investors and more about these overseas Chinese who actually picked up their operations and moved them to mainland China. And there were a lot of investors from various parts of Southeast Asia, lots of Hong Kong investors, but the people that I want to talk about today and that I write about mostly in the book are Taiwanese investors or the Taishang. And here they are, the Taishang, such a big player, such a big factor in PRC popular culture that in 2012, there was a TV drama series about them that aired in the PRC. And I haven't actually watched it yet, but people who have tell me it's definitely worth a look. So Taiwanese investors have changed the PRC's economy. Everyone knows this. The Foxconn photo is kind of way too easy. But I also want to argue that the Taiwanese investors have changed the PRC in terms of culture and lifestyle as well. How have they done this? Well, they have done this by transferring Taiwan's own experience of export-oriented development to the mainland. We all, Buzz Lightyear. How does Buzz Lightyear get in here? Well, Buzz Lightyear, remember, thought that he was a real guy until he lifted up his glove and saw the words "made in Taiwan." And then he realized, I am not a real spaceman. I am actually a plastic toy. And it's a great joke. It's especially a great joke for people in my generation because we think of Taiwan as the place where plastic doodads come from, transistor radios, small electronics, shoes, clothing. In our childhood, made in Taiwan meant all those things. And, Buzz Lightyear doesn't take this news very well, but I think we should take this news really well because being able to have a global reputation as a manufacturing powerhouse, even if what you're making is Buzz Lightyear or Barbie, is still an enviable position for an economy to be in the post-war era. So what happened was that these kinds of manufacturing opportunities and specialties, which were nurtured and matured in Taiwan, ended up in China, thanks to these Taiwanese investors. So if you buy a real Buzz Lightyear now, it will not say made in Taiwan, it will say made in China. So how did we get to the point where Taiwan had an export manufacturing miracle to transfer to the PRC? Well, it starts in the Japanese era, so the pre-World War II Japanese colonial era, with some basic industrialization and infrastructure development that happened then. It gets a big push during the 1950s from Taiwan's agricultural reform, which freed up a lot of capital and labor through the explosive improvements in Taiwanese agricultural productivity. So you have the capital and labor for the investment in small and medium-sized enterprises that became a really important, even very small firms became very important links in global supply chains as they developed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The breakthrough moment for cross-strait economic relations came in 1987 when President Jiang Jingguo lifted the prohibition on travel to the mainland that had been in place since the end of the Chinese Civil War. And the purpose of lifting the travel ban was to enable elderly people who had been born on the mainland and come to Taiwan in the course of the Civil War and kind of gotten stuck there. He wanted them to be able to go home one more time and see their ancestors' graves and visit with family members that they had been divided from for decades. But when those people made those trips, mostly, honestly, elderly men, former soldiers and officials of the ROC government, when they made their trip, they took along their sons-in-law to carry the luggage. And those guys looked out, and what they saw was an incredible economic opportunity. Manufacturing in Taiwan was getting pretty expensive by 1987, and a lot of traditional manufacturing was starting to hit the ceiling in terms of the cost of production in Taiwan. But what they realized is that if they moved their production to mainland China, they could lower that ceiling by an enormous amount and give their businesses another opportunity to thrive. Many people saw this trend of traditional manufacturing moving to the PRC and kind of panicked. They thought, oh my gosh, we're hollowing out our economy. We're losing our manufacturing base. What are we going to do? But Taiwan's economy had yet another card up its sleeve, because as traditional manufacturing moved to the mainland, Taiwan developed this high-tech manufacturing industry that has actually more than filled the space left behind by the departure of traditional manufacturing. And as with the original growth of traditional manufacturing in Taiwan, the Taiwanese government played a big role in promoting and enabling high-tech manufacturing. So this is the Industrial Technology Research Institute of Taiwan, which is a joint public-private program that has incubated a lot of Taiwan's most famous high-tech firms. So by the late 1980s or the mid 1990s, there was very little sort of traditional Buzz Lightyear and Barbie style manufacturing left in Taiwan. It had relocated to the PRC. And along with it, and lagging slightly behind, was a lot of the branded contract manufacturing in more traditional sectors like shoes and apparel. So here's a photo that looks a lot like that SME manufacturing plant that I showed you a moment ago in Taiwan. This is a factory making a Taiwanese company that has moved its, looks like shooting baskets from the deep end operation over to Shanghai. This process was extremely fast. The velocity and magnitude was really staggering. If we look at trade statistics between 98 and 2018, you can see just how rapidly cross-strait trade grew. And you can also notice that cross-strait trade is unbalanced in favor of Taiwan. So Taiwan has a trade surplus with the mainland. I learned yesterday that Taiwan's exports to the PRC at the moment, 50% of them are semiconductors. So Taiwan is exporting high value components to the mainland, many of which, probably most of which, are actually manufactured or assembled in the PRC for export to a third. The end consumer is not in the PRC. You can also see that Taiwanese investment in the PRC increased really rapidly over the period between 1991 and 2011. Since 2011, the rate of growth has been a lot flatter than this graph would suggest. So how have Taishan contributed to the PRC economy? Well, in a number of ways, which I'll just run through very quickly. First of all, just in terms of the kind of financial, the cash contribution of Taiwanese investors, official statistics have it at about 190 billion. But because so much of Taiwan's investment to the PRC has been channeled through third parties, Hong Kong, but also places like BVI, Cayman, and even Panama, The actual amount of investment is probably closer to 600 billion. Another way that Taiwan has contributed to China's economic growth is through employment. And the amount of Taiwanese jobs created in the PRC is large, but it's especially large in the sense that it is concentrated in particular locations. So there are parts of China that are very heavily dependent on Taiwanese investors for employment. Taiwanese firms have also brought technology to the PRC, while a company like TSMC, the world leading semiconductor manufacturer, obviously is keeping its highest tech manufacturing in Taiwan. There is a lot of semiconductor manufacturing at a very high level in mainland China, sponsored by Taiwanese firms. And then management expertise, I think, is also a really important piece of this puzzle. So I'm using this image from the Gibby Wiki fandom to illustrate a concept that Chenming Chi, a sociologist and political economy specialist from Taiwan, has developed of the fortress in the air. The idea that these Taiwanese supply chains moved en masse to the mainland, set up operations, working together, collaborating in the same way that they had done in Taiwan, with very few connections, actually, in many cases, to the local firms. And so they hired PRC workers, but the management and the sort of white collar, the engineering, the business services all stayed within the group of Taiwanese investors. Finally, I think a really critical contribution that Taiwanese have made to the PRC's economic development is introducing PRC entities, individual workers, organizations, local governments, and now increasingly suppliers into global supply chains. So it's not easy to make things for these global brands like Nike, Adidas, Apple, or Schwinn. But because Taiwanese were trusted manufacturers for those brands back in Taiwan, when they moved their operations to the PRC, those brands continued to value those supply chain relationships, and the Taiwanese factories in the PRC were able to continue those relationships. And now many PRC local firms are beginning to get into these supply chains as well, but I don't think they would have been able to do so without being introduced through the Taiwanese companies. So what did the Taishan get out of all of this? Well, they got a new lease on life, right? A lot of these traditional manufacturers were not going to survive in the cost structure that existed in Taiwan in the late 1980s. But by moving operations to the PRC, they were able to not only survive, but really thrive and grow. So I also just want to conclude by making a few comments about other aspects of the Taiwanese participation in the PRC economy and kind of consumer environment, ways that Taiwanese have also gone beyond business to influence the PRC. Affordable luxury, this idea that we can all enjoy a Starbucks level experience at a PRC price, is something that Taiwanese retail and service companies have really built up in mainland China. So, you know, the whole wedding photography concept and industry is huge in China now. It came from Taiwan, and the Taiwanese manufacturers are still the preferred purveyors of those wedding photography goods. Also, 85 Degrees, the coffee chain, which is kind of like a Starbucks experience at a China price. Taiwanese also have introduced philanthropy into the PRC. This is an article about the Tzu Buddhist Compassion Association opening China's first overseas NGO office, but I write about many other philanthropic undertakings that Taiwanese have brought to the mainland as well. Religion, a lot of religious practices were driven underground during the Cultural Revolution and had a hard time reviving. Taiwanese religious pilgrims have reintroduced aspects of religious practice and belief that people in the mainland were hungry for, but needed someone to help them reconnect. Also popular culture, right? From Teresa Deng to Ame, Taiwanese pop culture icons are and have been, maybe a little bit less today than in the past, but for a long time, were really where the energy for experimentation in pop culture came from in the mainland. And even the PRC's spoken language has been affected by Taiwan. The word tongzhi, which means comrade in the PRC, was adopted by LGBT communities in Taiwan as a kind of ironic way of referring to one another. But you see that that tongzhi now means LGBT in the PRC as well, which I imagine is sometimes kind of confusing. And then here's another one that I didn't even write about in the book, but I just learned about from my good friend Karim Friedman, an anthropologist who works in Huadong University in Taiwan, that the whole sort of Chinese tea ceremony is actually also a Taiwanese invention. So just to wrap up, I think this is a story that is nearing its conclusion. The PRC indigenous firms have become very capable, and they have taken over many of the roles that Taiwanese firms initiated in the PRC. That's the red supply chain, right? The idea that we no longer need Taiwanese investors in the mainland in order to fill the spaces in global supply chains. And it's also true that a lot of Taiwanese investors are finding the PRC a less congenial environment for their own operations than it once was. So while the relationship continues to be very, very strong and important to both sides, it's not growing in the way it was a decade or two ago. But I think that it's important to remember where the PRC's, where many of these initiatives originated. So I'm going to stop my sharing now and hand it back to Bruce Dickson.
Okay. There's a quick, great overview of the book. For those of you who have not read it, there's obviously much more detail in the book. But Shelley, you've already written some of the best books on Taiwan's domestic politics. So this is sort of a nice extension of your previous work of looking a little bit about domestic politics, but much more the economic developments within Taiwan and their economic relationships between Taiwan and China. We learn as much about Taiwan's political economy as we do about the relationship between Taiwan and China. Because in order to understand Taiwan's influence on China, you have to understand kind of the structure of Taiwanese firms and how they develop that way. So there's a focus on the small to medium enterprises, not the big conglomerates that we see in Korea and Japan. There's a practice of focusing on components, not final products, of manufacturing for other brand names. We certainly see that clearly in the Chinese case, where everything is made in China, but most of us don't have any Chinese brands. There's Nike, it's Apple, it's Mattel for the toy figures. The fact that the way in which wealth is passed down from one generation to the next in families is one reason why the firms are organized the way they are, and why they branch out in the way that they do. And we see similar things happening in China today as well. But the real value added for the book, if you will, is really the relationship, the cross-strait relationship, and how Taiwan influenced China's economic development. what you refer to as the second spring of having Taiwanese firms that sort of reached the limits of what they could do in Taiwan because of rising wages, because of new constraints on polluting, different constraints that it was hitting the bottom line of these companies. And so moving to China was a great way of getting a second spring, a new lease on life, learning how they would prosper in that some ways a culturally similar environment, but also profound differences that they ran up against. Some of the relationship is built on exporting. Some of it was selling into the China market. And then, as you mentioned at the end, the Taiwan influence over in China is not just economic, commercial activities, but pop culture and religion, anthropology, and so on. I love the example in the book where the government sent out a directive telling people they had to stop using the Taiwanese style of Mandarin with its slightly affected softer style speaking, and then stick to the standard pronunciation that was on the mainland. They didn't particularly like the fact that people were borrowing from Taiwan in terms of how the broadcasters were talking on the air and so on. So I have two questions before we go to the general Q&A with the audience. And the first one has to do with the tension in the book between the tiger leading the dragon, which is the name of the book, how Taiwan provided a model that Chinese firms learn from. And as you put it, eventually the student outdid the teacher in this regard. At the same time, as you mentioned about the desire of the Taiwanese companies to not share their technology, not share their some of the design features. They didn't want to hire local Chinese managers, so they were willing to hire line workers. They wanted to protect their supply chains. They were worried about having their technology and their products stolen by Chinese competitors. So on the one hand, they're the teacher. On the other hand, they're trying to protect what's most valuable. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how they navigated those two different strategies.
Sure. Yeah. From the very beginning, there has always been some ambivalence for Taiwan, for Taiwanese investors, but especially for the Taiwanese government about, is this going to be good for us? And because, ironically, another sort of paradox of this relationship, which is exactly as you describe, we need this cost structure in order to maintain our contracting relationships with these global brands that know how much cheaper it is to manufacture in China. So they've, a lot of these companies, Taiwanese contract manufacturers, they've gotten instruction from their customers, you need to lower your costs and we know how you're going to do it, so they never really had total agency in how or whether to move. So they instituted a lot of practices to try and gain some control over how that movement of manufacturing to the mainland would affect their core business. And so the whole fortress in the air concept is about, making sure that you are minimizing the opportunities for leverage by Chinese entities over the Taiwanese businesses. Leverage and also penetration so that you lose proprietary information, because the Taishan were never under any illusion that they were somehow above or outside of the competitiveness of the PRC manufacturing environment. And they knew that as good as they could be, at schmoozing with local party secretaries, they were never actually going to be the local guys in most places. So to the extent to which a competitor can emerge, that competitor is just going to have an easier time navigating the political environment, which is super important, as we all know, in the Chinese economy. So, that paradox that you've described is very real, and I think created for a long time that fortress in the air kind of model. But another paradox is that it's precisely because the two governments in Beijing and Taipei never talk to each other or talk to each other very little. They talked to each other briefly in 1992, 93, 94, and then they stopped. That the investors were able to just do whatever they wanted. So on the one hand, it was totally lawless for the Taiwanese in the mainland. They had no protection. There's no consulate. There's no tax treaty. There's none of the stuff that protects investors normally. But there's also no regulation and no one telling you what you can and cannot do. So the fastest period of increase in cross-strait investment were the 8 years of the Chen Shui-bian presidency, when the whole political class in Taiwan, the leadership was saying we need to be careful about this, but there was no control over the actual behavior of business. So, you've pointed to one really interesting paradox here, and there are many others. It turns out that cross-strait relations is pretty interesting on all the dimensions.
And as one of the curiosities of the book that I hadn't quite focused on before, is that we normally focus on the political, the diplomatic elements of cross-strait relations and the ups and downs of that relationship, which have almost nothing to do with what's happening at the economic level. I mean, if you try and trace, was 92 a turning point? No, not really. Was Chen Shui-bian a turning point? In some ways, yes, but not in terms of the economics. So that was sort of a fascinating sort of the lack of an impact on the business relationships that came about from it. The second question I have for you is, you begin by describing how we really can't pinpoint, actually accurately measure how much Taiwanese investment was going into China, how much the exports was responsible coming from Taiwanese owned firms. So if we could think of the impact, the influence of Taiwan in a different way, if they had not been active in the China market, they had not invested, China had not learned from Taiwan in that direct way, would China's economic growth be different today, or would it be kind of similar?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And even though, a sensible social scientist would say, how could I possibly answer your counterfactual hypothetical question? Of course, I'm going to try. I am a big fan of the work of Huang Yasheng, who has this book called Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics. And that book it's not a new book. It's probably 20 years old. But in it, he argues that China was on a trajectory of kind of organic development on a more or less capitalist model in the rural areas in the 1980s. And so he's really talking about the TVEs, and there's a long-standing debate over what was the sort of fundamental nature of TVEs. His argument is that they were private, but in any case, what we know is that for some reason the TVEs kind of trailed off in the early 1990s, and Professor Huang's argument is that this was because of a policy change that shifted credit away from TVEs and sort of opportunity away from rural industrialization toward urban industrialization. And he attributes this to the appointment of Jiang Zemin and the sort of Shanghai group as the national leadership. So, but what happened, so whatever the reason for the downfall of the TVEs was, what we know happened was China went in for special economic zones and attracting foreign direct investment, first through the SEZs and then more broadly allowing foreign direct investment to penetrate more and more. So one answer to your question would be that without this kind of actual, it's not just money. It's like the people go in there and they build the factory and they make the thing in the factory and export it from China. And Chinese workers learn how to do that kind of production, and Chinese managers learn how to negotiate with global brands or global sourcing managers, whatever they're called. Like, I remember interviewing a Taiwanese guy in Shanghai in 2006, and I walked into his office and he said, "Oh, you're an Eddie Bauer customer, aren't you?" Because he sourced clothes for Eddie Bauer in the mainland. And he had this entire career in the apparel industry in Taiwan. And everything was just like closing down all around him. So he kind of retired. And then a friend said, you can do the same thing in Shanghai, only on a way bigger scale, make a lot more money, deal with more interesting clients. And he personally said, this is my life started over again when I got here. I thought it was ended. I thought I was finished. And then I got here and I get to do all the same stuff, only on this bigger stage. So would it have been possible for TVE style manufacturers in the PRC to have those kinds of relationships and to become those kinds of suppliers without this sort of intermediate step of an existing player in that world coming to China? My answer is probably not. And I'm not sure that would have, in the long run, have been worse for China. I sort of agree with Huang Yasheng that the trajectory that China has taken it's produced a lot of wealth, but it's produced a lot of problems for the PRC as well. But so maybe that more sort of organic and gradual development of the PRC as a balanced investment and consumption, on a more balanced investment and consumption model, would have eventually yielded Chinese companies that could compete in this way and could function in these global supply chains. But I think it would have taken a lot longer and it would have looked very different.
Which that's the Gerschenkron argument about late developers. They have the benefit, they can develop faster because they've got existing models to emulate, to borrow from. And so that's part of the China stories, that they were able to follow Taiwan and the other dragons in terms of how they had developed so rapidly. Well, I don't want to hog up all our time. So Richard, I'm going to pass it back to you for the general Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Shelley and Bruce, for a great conversation. And Shelley, you can please leave your video up now for the Q&A, as well as you, Bruce, if you'd like. So before we start to ask questions from the audience, which keep them coming, there are great questions being asked right now, I would like to ask one question for Shelley. And another duality that you are exploring in the book is the risk but opportunity when it comes to cross-strait investment and interaction on an economic and people-to-people level. And in the book, you explore social movements in Taiwan that have come up in some respects as a response to some of this cross-strait interaction, including the anti-media monopolization movement and in 2012 and the Sunflower movement in 2014, as well as how Taiwan society is reacting to current actions being undertaken in Hong Kong and in other places in China. And you write in here, and I'll quote from the book, it's clear in retrospect that the quantitative and qualitative changes in cross-strait relations during the Ma Ying-jeou administration were simply too much for Taiwan society to absorb at the time. With the KMT chairperson elections just ended with Eric Chu, the new leader, as well as looking forward into next by-elections as well as national elections in Taiwan, how do you see that duality of opportunity versus risk in the social and economic spheres of Taiwan developing? And how how do you see Taiwanese political leaders consider that aspect when they devise different economic policies with regards to investment in China or diversify investments to other locations?
Wow, that's a great question. When I started writing this book a really long time ago, and all these other projects just kept interceding. And I have a really heavy teaching schedule and these wonderful students that I never want to stop bothering them. So my editor on this book was super patient, waiting for it to come out. She actually retired a month after it was published. So friends out there who have book deadlines, you got to actually get it done because your editor might retire and then I don't know what happens to your contract. But part of the reason that I'm actually not sorry that it took so long was that when the original deadline for this manuscript arrived, I didn't know how the story was going to end. I felt like we were in the midst of something and we might be like at the top of the parabola. We might be nearing the top. We might be on the way down. It just wasn't clear to me. It is clear to me now that the era of maximum win-win economic engagement between the PRC and Taiwan is over. And what's happening now is those companies that can do well in the PRC are remaining in the PRC, but they are much more cautious about expanding their operations because, for example, like if you want, so everybody's talking about the power crisis, the electrical power crisis in China this week. The best coverage of that is in the Taiwan media because there are all these Taiwanese factory managers who are like, yeah, I had to take 2 lines off production for 48 hours, or yes, we were in the middle of something and the lights went out, so they recognize that the bottlenecks in the mainland economy are significant and are affecting them. They also recognize that there is now a backlash to the PRC among their customers, especially the US, but also Australia, Europe, Canada, that they need to possibly diversify operations outside of China in order to continue to have the confidence of their clients. So there are lots of things that are complicating even the most committed firms in the PRC. But then for sort of average Taiwanese people, I think what really happened during the Ma administration was prior to 2008, which is when President Ma was elected, it was a one-way street, right? People went from Taiwan to the PRC and back, but people were not coming from the PRC to Taiwan. Money went from Taiwan to the PRC, but money did not come back. But during the first Ma administration, there were a lot of agreements that were made between the two sides because finally they could make agreements, right? They're finally talking to each other again for the first time since the mid-1990s. There were a lot of agreements and they were more two-sided. And suddenly, it's a two-way street. And I think there was a backlash to that on the financial front. The sunflower movement was kind of catalyzed by the cross-strait services trade agreement. So people thinking, wow, service providers are going to be able to open businesses in the mainland, in Taiwan. So mainland hairdressers or restaurant chains or whatever are going to be able to open up over here. what's that? How can we possibly compete? Because, you know, people in Taiwan know how competitive the PRC market is. So how are we going to be able to compete? But I think at the same time, a much more in your face dimension of this same phenomenon was the arrival of PRC tourists. And the number of PRC visitors to Taiwan went from 0 to something like 4 million in 5 years. So one day, most people in Taiwan have never met someone who actually lives in the PRC. And then 5 years later, PRC people are everywhere. And I think there was this sense of, oh my gosh, if we make this a two-way thing, we will be completely overwhelmed. Not necessarily in a bad way. I'm not suggesting that, you know, everybody thought it was nefarious. It was just China's too large. The mainland is too large. And if the mainland tries to come to Taiwan, there will be no room for Taiwanese here. And so that's when you see this sharp increase in all kinds of sort of keep them out political and social movements. And that's really what brought down, I think, Ma Ying-jeou, or the KMT. I mean, Ma Ying-jeou was reelected in 2012. You know, people did not reject him completely. And, you know, there's a lot of merit to a lot of his policies. I don't want to sort of portray this as wholly negative, but I think it was too much too soon, and it frightened people in Taiwan. And so in 2016, they elected the president from a different party. And I don't think that we are ever going to go back to a scenario in which Taiwanese are open to finding out what happens when we just lift restrictions.
Great. So I'll start asking questions from our very patient audience. Thank you so much. And also, we've posted in the chat a discount code for the book. So if you haven't already, please check that out and check out the book. First question I want to ask you is from Shihoku Goto at the Wilson Center. What are the lessons to be learned for Taiwan as it looks to protect its tech advantage? And can you also discuss the flow of human capital and brain drain in positioning Taiwan?
Sure. On the technical front, or the technology front, I think Taiwanese firms have come to understand that you've got to keep your best secrets in Taiwan, right? So if you look at TSMC, the story of TSMC's interactions with the PRC government, the Taiwan government, that's like a whole nother book. But someone like Douglas Fuller, who's a genius expert on semiconductor industry, should write that book. But and he kind of already has. But you know, for a long time, it was the Taiwanese government that was telling TSMC, you know, you can't do whatever, however many nanometers it was at any given moment, production in the mainland. You need to keep that production here. I think now TSMC knows that, you know, they've got to keep their best and most advanced technology in Taiwan. And in fact, you know, the interesting question that we're talking about now is, will they put their best and most advanced technology in the US? Because, you know, the Defense Department would like for that kind of production to be done, you know, under our dome. But for TSMC, you know, I don't know, as a company, is that the right call? So I think they have learned a lot about the importance of protecting intellectual property, and also of remaining agile and spending on research and development, so that if it is inevitable that you're going to lose your technical advantage, that you have a new something that you're going to do next. So Taiwanese companies, at least in the high-tech space, are investing a lot in research and development so that they can be they can stay ahead of the technology losses that they're experiencing. And what was the second part of the question, Richard?
About brain drain and human capital flows.
Yeah, so I'm very interested in this, and I'm trying to get data from a some colleagues in Taiwan. We are working together to get data from actually the Taiwanese government to try and figure out how real this brain drain thing is. So certainly a lot of Taiwanese managers and engineers go to the PRC to work. And there's no question that the PRC is continually recruiting them and trying to lure them with these incentive programs. What I don't understand then is why we are simultaneously regaled constantly by Taiwanese companies with the complaint that there's no talent or not enough talent in Taiwan. You know, if there's enough talent to fulfill the PRC market, why is there, you know, why are these Taiwanese companies not able to take advantage of the talent in Taiwan? And I think it's about money and what you're willing to pay, right? So it's an economic problem, but it's worth thinking about why PRC companies can pay more than Taiwanese companies to the same, potentially the same engineer. But at the same time, the other complaint that I hear a lot is that Taiwan has an overeducated workforce. And, you know, what we really need are people to work in factories, and it's high-tech factories. So they need to know how to run a computer and do math. But, you know, we don't need all these college graduates. So I am agnostic on the whole brain drain agenda. I don't think I believe that Taiwan has either a shortage of talent or an excess of talent. I think what Taiwan has is a mismatch between financial capital and human capital that has actually been a little bit improved. I wouldn't say that mismatch has disappeared, but the COVID catastrophe, which sent a lot of entrepreneurial talent scampering to Taiwan for a safe haven from COVID, has had some effect on the kind of environment for innovation and opportunity in Taiwan, although I don't really know enough to say any more than that.
Great, thanks for your response. I have a question from Tina Chung with the Voice of America Chinese branch. Specifically about CPTPP, or the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for a Trans-Pacific Partnership. But I might also broaden this out to be something that's kind of global in scope, because your book covers a lot of the cross-strait interactions, but you also do mention the global or the multinational part in MNCs and Taiwan's firms having to go global. Especially with you were mentioning contract manufacturing and things like that with global brands such as Nike. So Tina Chung asks, what are prospects for Taiwan's accession into CPTPP, given China's Taiwan Affairs Office recently opposing Taiwan's membership in this agreement? And then broadening it out further, where do you see Taiwan's firms or global businesses going regionally or abroad? What do you see are the strategies or potentials for Taiwan to accede into other trade partnerships or other types of organizations?
Yeah, you know, I think the highest impact act of the Trump administration with regard to Taiwan was not any of the things that people ever talk about arms sales or phone calls or, you know, sending U.S. officials. The single most significant thing the Trump administration did was killing U.S. participation in the TPP on day one of his presidency. And no amount of everything else that was done that I put on that list just a minute ago can begin to make up for that one terrible mistake. Because ultimately, what Taiwan needs to survive is to thrive economically. And Taiwan can't thrive economically if it is excluded from the global economy. And the point of TPP was to embed Taiwan, or not the point. You know, here I am talking like Taiwan is the only thing that matters in the world. Sorry about that. One of the motivations for TPP was to create a high quality trade agreement that the PRC would not be anywhere close to meeting the standards for, and that would therefore allow Taiwan a place to participate. So the loss of TPP in the first instance was, you know, it was going to be hard to get Taiwan into TPP even then, but CPTPP is even harder because it doesn't have the US as the advocate for Taiwan. On the other hand, the environment has changed a lot in the last 4 years in ways that may make it slightly more possible for Taiwan to find its way into CPTPP. So other countries that 4 years ago might have been more willing to carry water for Beijing may be less willing to do so now. And it may be possible for Taiwan to secure bilateral trade agreements of some kind, including with the US, that would then be a sort of platform for easing, you know, sort of like when, you know, if the bed of the truck is up here and they lower that thing down, if you push the pallet of goods onto that elevator, it's easier to get it into the truck. So the bilateral trade agreements may have that sort of elevating function for Taiwan, but it will not be easy. And it's really unfortunate because I do think that Taiwan's economy is its greatest strength, and it is a very, very vibrant economy. Even now, it is very innovative, and it stinks that we haven't done more to integrate it more completely into international trade frameworks.
Actually, to pull a bit further on the U.S. impact angle that you were remarking on, one aspect of the book that you cover is the U.S.'s influence in Taiwan's own economic development. In the 50s and 60s, U.S. Agency for International Development and others, technical advisors and their role, and the confluence of these technocratic forces coming together on Taiwan, as well as Cold War realities. So Josh Pope, a graduate of GW's Elliott School, asks if you could talk a bit more about these of Taiwanese agricultural and land reforms in the 1950s that kind of set the stage for Taiwan's economic development, and whether reinvestment from landowners into small, medium enterprises was intended, or do we see Taiwan's economic rise as a lot of good luck from these different forces?
Yes, I think it was absolutely intentional. I think the transformation of Taiwan's economy was very strategic. The KMT, the ruling party in Taiwan after World War II, recognized that they had failed to remain in power in the mainland because of economic factors, right? They could not they couldn't make the mainland economy work. And as a result, they ended up losing the Civil War and losing the mainland to communism. And they were not going to let that happen again in Taiwan. So they were aided in the reforms that they made by the fact that they had kind of crushed the owning class in Taiwan in the 228 incident and White Terror. So these kinds of very violent moves to subjugate Taiwan's indigenous, or not indigenous in the sense of the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, but Taiwan's native-born elite were subjugated so that they did not have the same kind of complicating role in politics that landlords and capitalists had in the mainland. So, you know, there's like a dark shadow all over all of this story. But what they were able to do was to transfer ownership of land to the people who were farming it. So a lot of Taiwanese agriculture was either large scale, often Japanese government owned, or people renting or working for landlords. And so, this land to the tiller program increased the productivity of agriculture super fast. It absorbed the labor force so that, people were working more intensively, but then it very quickly freed up a labor force, and especially seasonally. So when you have farmers making more money, you have an education system that is working, and you have no regulation about urbanization, so where industry can actually happen, that combination produced a lot of family businesses that were both agricultural and industrial. So when we need to be out there doing agricultural work, we are out there doing agricultural work. The whole family is. But when there's nothing we really need to be doing in the fields, then we are in the garage, putting Christmas light bulbs into the little metal fit screw thingy. And we are doing that all day, every day. And then we are passing that down to the guys next door who wire the little screw thingies onto the strands. And by the way, we got the bulbs from the glass factory next. I visited this cluster probably in 1991, where like right out the back window is rice paddy. But in here, we are making Christmas lights for export to the US. And so, that the opportunity to use capital for in more industrial processes rather than just reinvesting in agriculture spawned a lot of this small and medium-sized enterprises. But there's one more component where I think the Taiwanese state, we got to give some credit. Well, really two. One is on the marketing front. The Taiwanese government facilitated the sale of all of this stuff to customers abroad. So they helped these little teeny companies get to market in ways that would have been very difficult for, people in the middle of nowhere in Taiwan making Christmas lights to do. But the other thing the Taiwanese government did was to make sure that the glass, the plastic, the metal, the cement, the logistics were all available, so that the upstream parts of the industrial economy were dominated by state-owned enterprises, KMT party-owned enterprises, and a small but increasingly important group of private companies like Formosa Plastics. That ensured that all of these SMEs, if they want to do injection molding, they go to a trade fair in Taipei where where these guys who need injection molded plastics for stuff they're making in the US are lining up and, saying, who can make one of these for this price? And the Taiwanese, so everybody in the village sends one guy up there to take orders for all of that. And then they get their plastic from Formosa Plastic or, some state-owned plastics factory. And in this way, everybody is able to kind of maximize the opportunity to mobilize that rural labor for global production.
Yeah, and actually, that's one of the aspects I was made a strong impression on me about describing these economic clusters and that they move wholesale, pun intended, to mainland China as part of this production techniques. I had a question now that it relates to a little bit of identity and the politics of cross-strait ties. In the book, we talked about people-to-people ties, and towards the end, you also describe pop culture and music and the figure of Ame as well, and her legacy, and now known goes by Kulele Amit, and what the cross-strait political dynamic, how that affects people-to-people ties, because she went through certainly different phases in her musical career, and you do also compare that to the cross-strait dynamics that she and other artists or creatives have had to live with. And so Alexa Jobin, GW professor of English, asks, how have the contrasting Taiwanese and Chinese ideologies of Sinophobic independence and unification dichotomies impacted Taiwan's shifting roles in the rise of China? And maybe we can go through that from the people-to-people angle or the economic angle.
Yeah, so I think that opinion in Taiwan kind of ranges on a spectrum from, I'm actually very happy to hear the word xenophobic used here, because that's a word that I find really helpful. Like, it's not anti-China, but it's xenophobic. So a spectrum from sinophilic, the people who really value their Chinese identity. They may call themselves Taiwanese, but they see themselves as meaningfully connected to Chinese civilization, Chinese culture, Chinese history, whatever they think of the PRC state, through the people who are, I think, the bulk of Taiwan's population who are kind of sino-skeptical. So they recognize that there are opportunities in the mainland, but there are also risks associated with it, and that the PRC government is hostile to Taiwan, to the Taiwanese government, and increasingly now, that sino-skeptical group would say that PRC government is hostile even to Taiwanese people, which has not always been the case. And then at the end of the spectrum, the sinophobic, the sort of deep green, Taiwan has nothing to do with China. That is still, I would say, a minority position, but it is certainly one that we hear from a lot. And it's one that gains momentum from experiences like Ame or Amit has had, where any deviation from the PRC's required kind of capitulation to the PRC's view of what Taiwan is and what it means is punished by exclusion from those opportunities. So what Ame did wrong was to sing the ROC national anthem at Chen Shui-bian's inauguration, and she was blacklisted in the mainland for a long time because of that. And in my book, I draw out the hypothesis, which I do not know, I've never interviewed her, although I would be totally starstruck and sound stupid if I did. So it's probably best that I never have. But I think that her sort of reinvention as an indigenous person, and meaning the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, and a very powerful feminist voice, is sort of like when, what happens when Taiwanese are sort of awakened to the fact that the PRC government is treating them as an enemy, as an adversary, or as a naughty school child that needs a spanking from the schoolmaster. And I think that is also part of where I realize now we are in the parabola of this economic relationship, is we are on the downside, because this extends even to business. So the Made in China 2025 plan was a real shot across the bow for Taiwanese high-tech manufacturers, because if you read it, what it says is not, 70% of our semiconductors will be made in the PRC by 2025. It will be made by PRC companies, and that does not include these Taiwanese companies that have gone to China and created a high-tech sector in the PRC, right? So I think there is this sense that maybe Taiwanese are sino-skeptical mostly still, but they feel a sort of Taiwanophobia radiating from the other side. And it definitely does not make any aspect of the relationship easier.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Shelley. We're already at time. Amazed the conversation went by so quickly. And thank you all, everyone, for your questions. We're so sorry that if we couldn't get to them. Perhaps, Shelley, we can send you questions separately and we can get responses to some of these questions
Sure.
here. And please watch out for your emails for our book giveaway. Thank you all again for answering questions. And as the conversation we just had, I think, indicates with the audience as well as with Bruce Dickson, the scope is quite massive and impressive, talking about Taiwan's economic development and history, its relationship with the PRC, and the people-to-people political, security, and economic ties therein. And all of this and more is in Shelley's book, The Tiger Leading the Dragon. So I cannot recommend her book more. It is a refreshing and fun read, honestly, that will serve as a great starting point to talk about political economy and Taiwan in the world today. So thank you, everybody, for attending our event today. And please join me in thanking Shelley Rigger for all of her great work in publishing this book.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Great. Have a great day, everybody.